This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Laura Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Tara Littlefield, and Tara is the Plant Conservation Manager at the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. It's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
Thank you for having me.
And so today we're going to talk about the Rare Plant Program at the Kentucky Nature Preserves. But before we go into that, tell us a little bit about how you became interested in plants.
I grew up here in Kentucky. I'm from Hardin County, grew up in the country. I had a very free childhood. I was always taking little expeditions to collect daffodils, going through little woodlots and fields. And my older brother, who is 3 years older than me, he actually came to the Forestry department and took several dendrology classes when I was in high school, and he would come back and teach me all of my trees. So in middle school and high school, we had that kind of relationship. Mm-hmm. So my brother was what initially got me really interested in botany.
That's really neat. Yeah.
So it's just kind of been an innate calling almost, actually, to me as well. Mm-hmm. So.
And then where did you do your undergraduate degree?
My path in my professional career has not always been a linear thing. Mm-hmm. When I first graduated high school and decided to go to college, I had no idea that you could even get that type of degree, like a plant degree or a botany degree or something revolving more types of things I like to do, like wandering in the woods and identifying everything. I actually went to college for chemistry, and I got a chemistry degree from the University of Louisville. And initially I was doing the pre-med thing. Mm-hmm. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I thought if it was really hard, then anything else that I did after that would be easier. But yeah, I really just had no idea what I wanted to do. So it wasn't until after I graduated with my chemistry degree, I moved out west, and I was actually in a PhD program for chemistry out there and hiked all the time and just realized, what am I doing with my life? And I knew what I did like to do was be outdoors and study the natural communities and plants and animals too. You pick up all that stuff along the way. You're out just doing things outdoors. So then I came back to Kentucky and kind of had no idea, and I ended up in the Forestry department here in Lexington. And I worked for Tom Barnes as a tech, and I traveled around the state a little bit with him and collected rare plant seeds actually, and grew plants for him in the greenhouse. And then I ended up meeting up with Dr. Mary Arthur and Dr. Barton, and ended up getting my master's with them. And I was actually able to connect the chemistry to the ecology, to actually like studying things on a microscopic scale, to then with my master's I studied ecosystem science with Mary Arthur, like carbon and nitrogen cycling in the forests, in different age class forests, from clear cuts all the way to old growth forests. And so that was really cool. And it got me out looking at plants, which I have always loved doing as really a hobby. Yeah, so that I connected my undergrad and my master's in that way. And then my first job I landed after getting my master's was with the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. Okay. So, and I've been there for 14 years now. So
that's great. That's a great path. Yeah. So last week we did a show with Zeb Weiss. He's the executive director of the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, and he did a great job of talking about that program. But for those of our listeners that may not have heard last week's show, can you just kind of give a little bit of an overview of what the Kentucky Nature Preserves is?
Yeah. So we are a state organization, and our mission, kind of in a nutshell, is to conserve Kentucky's natural heritage. There's several different programs that we administer with the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, but one of our main kind of focuses is on species of conservation concern, protecting, managing, monitoring, databasing all of the rare plants and animals that occur throughout Kentucky. And not just the plants and animals as individual species, but as aggregations of natural communities. So we track high quality natural communities as well. So that kind of goes into that saying, Tom Barnes used to work here in the Forestry Department and wrote the book Kentucky's Last Greatest Places. That's kind of what we do at the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. We protect those, we identify and protect those.
So tell us what you do as the plant conservation manager.
So I mentioned I've worked at Nature Preserves for 14 years now. Initially, when I first started working for Nature Preserves, I was a natural heritage botanist. I spent like 75% of my time in the field, surveying for rare plants and communities all across the state. It was kind of like a treasure hunt. We have this natural heritage database that houses the information of all the rare plants and animals all across the state.
Just the state?
Yeah, just the state.
Just
So,
okay.
Well, I could go into that a little bit more. We are part of a national organization. We call it our parent organization, and it's called NatureServe. And every state in North America and South America as well, and then we also have a Canada branch as well, feeds their rare plant and animal information into this larger database. And we're called natural heritage programs, although every state has a little bit different names. But we all feed our rare species and natural community information into this larger database. And the reason why we do that is, how do we even know if something is rare?
Right.
We can tell if it's rare within our state. For example, we'll say a particular goldenrod, white-haired goldenrod, for example. That's one of our Kentucky endemic plants that only grows in the Red River Gorge. But how do we know it only occurs only in this state? We network with this larger North and South America organization that can then network all the different states to figure out how rare a particular species is across its range. So that's kind of how we feed into that larger network. I'll go back to what we were initially talking about, me and what I did for the first decade of my career at Nature Preserves is looking at this database that houses all this information, coming up with priorities to focus on certain particular rare plants or communities, going out and trying to refine them. Sometimes, they're old historic records, 30, 40 years old. Sometimes we're looking for new rare plant and community records. So it's kind of like, you got a dot or a particular lead for a particular area, and this is private and public land. So the managed area boundaries are, we can't really look at that when we're focusing on rarity. So yeah, that's kind of what a good majority of my job has been, is just going out and monitoring, looking at different conservation strategies to protect these rare plants, and that's a whole other topic in and of itself. Over the past several years, within our organization, within state government, we did a little bit of reorganization. We brought in several new programs. We did always do kind of the rare plant program, which since about 1986, when we entered into that cooperative agreement, and we are the state cooperators for all the federally listed plants. So for animals, it's Kentucky Division of Fish and Wildlife within state government, but we are the plant cooperators. So that kind of gives us that main role within the state to deal with all of the plants of conservation concern. We also, I think it was in 1994, we actually passed the Rare Plant Act in Kentucky. So it's actually legislation that we, as a state organization, we always have to go back to our statutes and regulations and why we do things. Why are we focusing on plant conservation within state government? And that ties back to our relationship as the state cooperators for federally listed plants in Kentucky, but it also ties back to in 1994 the passing of the Rare Plant Recognition Act, and that gives our organization kind of mandates to create and update the Rare Plant Act. And that is a state listing of all of the rare plants within the state. And so we have that list, and every 4 years we're constantly revising and working on it.
And about how many do you have on that list?
Okay, so that's a good question. To give you some context, We have about 2,800 plants, native plants known from the state. And, we have a lot of non-native plants as well. Cumulatively, I think our flora is about, maybe around 3,400 plants total that we constantly have in our minds. When we do inventories, we're looking for single species, but we're also looking at every single species. So it's a lot of plants to kind of jumble around in your brain. But we evaluate all of those plants and assign state ranks, coefficient of conservation ranks that helps us then figure out how rare that is within the state and within its global range. Then we can be more confident in our designations of this is a state endangered plant, this is a state threatened plant. We have state endangered, state threatened, special concern. We have a candidate list, which we're constantly, gathering new information. I mean, the state's huge. Now we have a more formal plant conservation section within nature preserves, and I manage that team. And there's approximately 5 of us right now that go around the whole state now and do these types of surveys, monitoring, coming up with conservation strategies. So I manage that team. I do a lot of the field work that I did the first decade of my career there, but then I also now have like a team that I can go out and do stuff with and help. So Devin Rogers, Heidi Braunreiter, Kendall McDonald, Tony Romano, and Rachel Cook. And I think Rachel Cook actually came from
the NRES program.
Yes. Yep. So we just hired her on as our field seasonal this year. So we've actually kind of built up this botany team over the past few years. And that's a whole other topic. How do you do that kind of thing?
Right.
And it involves partnerships. A lot of grant writing. But
you've mentioned, it sounds like there's levels.
Yeah.
And so how many different levels of rare plants are there? I mean, it sounds like there's highly endangered and then not so much. Yep. And, so what are the stages of a rare plant, I guess is the main question.
That's a really good question. When we have a particular plant within the state, it has multiple designations. We call them state ranks and global ranks. A particular plant that's really common within Kentucky and common in the eastern United States, that would have a global rank, and it's a 1 through 5 scale. It would have a global rank of 5. So it's a G5. This thing is really common across many, many states, across the whole eastern United States. We'll just give red maple, for example. That is a globally common plant. It's a very common within the state. So G5, globally common 5. It also has an S5, state common, so S5. So on the flip side of that really common plant, red maple, we have a very rare plant. So maybe something that only occurs within Kentucky, a Kentucky endemic plant. And I'll go back to that white-haired goldenrod example. That's a really rare goldenrod that only occurs in Kentucky. It only occurs in a small area within Kentucky, which is the Red River Gorge and the rock shelters. And so that's what we would call a Kentucky endemic plant. Globally, it's only in the state. It's that would be a G1 or a G2. I think that one is technically a G2 because when you're actually evaluating what rank to give it, how many individual populations plays into that as well. So something with a G1, S1 rank, which would be the rarest of the rare, possibly you only have 1 or 2 locations where that particular plant occurs. And we do have one of those. That's the Kentucky clover, which is actually a newly described species from the bluegrass, which is a whole other topic in terms of 2020. And we still don't know all of the plants that occur within our state. And there's undescribed species. There's certain levels of endemism that occur in different regions within our state. So that's like a whole different topic.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
So back to different levels of a plant and how you would designate it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we talked about the really common stuff and then the really rare stuff. So Kentucky clover, it only occurs in 2 spots in some tributaries of the Kentucky River in the whole world. So it's globally rare, G1, and within the state we only have 2 spots where it occurs. So that's an S1. Mm-hmm. So that goes from state endangered to globally common. Mm-hmm. So and there's all kinds of different designations within those 2 kind of far extremes. Mm-hmm. Plants are rare for numerous reasons. There's situations that you can designate a plant if it's globally common, but we just in Kentucky happen to be on the edge of its range. So you can have a globally common plant, but where we are within the eastern United States, Kentucky just happens to be on the edge of its range. Mm-hmm. So you can have a state rare or a state endangered plant that just happens to also be globally common. And a lot of our mountain species are like that. With the Appalachians, we have we're part of the Appalachian Mountains in far southeast Kentucky. But because we only have a small portion of our state that has, that type of flora, and we are on the very edge of that whole entire Appalachian system, there's several dozen rare plants that occur within the mountains that are rare in Kentucky. So they have like an S1 or an S2, state endangered, state threatened. But they're really common in the main chain of the Appalachian Mountains.
So they can be both, basically.
They can be both, yeah. They can be globally common, but state rare.
Okay,
so.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So can you tell us, what's the process that you do to find a plant, or does a landowner call you and say, I have something unique on my land, or is it just while you guys are out surveying things? How do you identify that, either the new plant or find those rare plants?
That's a really good question. Yeah, sometimes this happens many times a year where we do get landowners that call us and want us to survey their property or think that they have something unique. And depending on our workload and how that fits into our priority natural area focus, we'll go out and we'll do surveys and get into the private landowner relationship that way. Mm-hmm. But I think more often than not, we have amazing tools with ArcGIS. We can do models of rare plant habitat and figure out where on the landscape it could potentially also occur. Or there's a plant called globe bladderpod. That's actually a good one. Or that is a really rare mustard species that only occurs in central Kentucky, in the Kentucky River tributaries, and also in the Nashville Basin in Tennessee. So it's a federally listed plant that we work on, and it occurs in habitats that are specific. It has to have a certain type of geology, a certain type of limestone, and there has to be a certain co-species that occur with it. Mm-hmm. Rocky, limestone, cedar, blue ash forests that have a certain steepness of the slope. And so you can run models for these types of plants. And
so it's a picky plant, basically.
It's a very picky plant. A lot of our rare plants are kind of like that. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of rare plants are rare because they're specific to a specific habitat. And that would be a good one. There's other plants, like, I keep coming to bluegrass plants just because we're in the bluegrass, but like running buffalo clover. I don't know if you guys have heard about running buffalo clover, but that is a plant that actually used to be common in the bluegrass in Kentucky, but because of habitat degradation and loss of the types of disturbance it needs, which is migrating buffalo and megafauna, which used to actually be really common here in the bluegrass. Right. So that plant actually declined and became rare because of habitat loss and loss of the disturbance regime it needs. And so, so sometimes you have rare plants that are rare because they're just tied to a very rare habitat that was always rare on the landscape, or sometimes plants can be rare because they've just 99% of their habitat has been wiped out by development or habitat loss. So I don't know the exact percentage, but a large percentage of Kentucky is in private ownership. And so most of the time when we, do that type of analysis for where a plant occurs across the state, it's going to fall into private ownership. And so we do a lot of working with the state PVAs or the county PVAs to look at who owns this particular land. For several of our projects, we do a lot of door knocking and reaching out to private ownerships to get permission to survey land. And for the most part, we build great relationships that way. If we identify a particular interesting plant on a private land, we have a registry program. It's a non-binding agreement that just allows us to let the landowner know that they have really cool things on their property, like a particular rare plant, and just allows that relationship to be defined. Like if we want to come on your property and just look at the plant or collect seed, things like that. Something that topic always runs into, because sometimes I go to a private landowner and they don't want anything rare to be found on their property. So that kind of question comes up. With plants, even if something is federally listed, there's no law that says that private landowner has to do this XYZ. There's no, the laws aren't like that for plants.
If there was a plant someplace on their property and they decided they wanted to build a house there, they could.
They could, yeah.
Okay.
They could.
You would hope they would call you and say you could dig it up first. But
yeah, exactly. So kind of our role there is to just provide guidance if it's needed and if the landowner is willing. There's been some times where we have had to do seed collection in a private land in order to then get something into a managed area, a public land. Zeb probably talked more about this, but talking a lot about like our plant animal surveys across the state, but a whole other part of nature preserves is actually buying conservation lands and then protecting them. Ties back to those protecting the last greatest places. Identify, outreach with the private landowner, and then purchasing. We run our Heritage Land Conservation Program, which is the state land acquisition program, and then turning those last greatest places into protected state nature preserves. So I think the tie-in there for the private landowners is, sometimes that results in that particular land becoming a state nature preserve. Sometimes it results in a conservation easement that's in private ownership. Sometimes that results in entering into a non-binding registered natural area agreement that just allows us on the property. And then sometimes we have to collect seed and then move it to a nearby natural area that has similar habitat if we can. So,
have you ever had a plant that basically, I guess, is died off and then you found it somewhere else and so it comes back on the list? Does that occur?
Yes. I'll give you an example to tie back into something that we already discussed, which is running buffalo clover. In general, there's not that many crazy botanists running around the state. Like, there's a huge amount of land out there. There's a lot of unsurveyed habitat. And so making this state list, it's always a work in progress. Back to what your question was, running buffalo clover. So that is a plant that was thought to be globally common, or, within the eastern United States. I think it's, maybe 9 or 10 states that historically had that plant. It was actually deemed completely extirpated. I don't know the exact year, but it was like in the 70s, 80s. It was just a consensus amongst the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agencies when they were looking in the 70s, endangered Species Act was passed, and so everyone was looking at, okay, is there any species that have become extinct that we need to worry about? And running buffalo clover was one of those that got on the list. This thing is extinct. There's all these records in herbariums that show that it was here, and now no one has seen this thing for several decades. It was, I think it was in 1987, Mark Evans, who was a botanist, ecologist that worked at nature preserves, found running buffalo clover up in Dinsmore Woods in Boone County, and that kind of resurrected it. I don't think that was the global, record that brought it from back to extinction, but that was our state record. It's like, no one has seen this plant. We thought it was state extirpated. They even thought it was extirpated from its entire range, and then with more focus and more boots on the ground, and people learning how to identify all these different clovers, right. Then you can find, there's new discoveries constantly, and it's the rare plant list is a work in progress, and there's so much undersurveyed habitat. So yeah, we're constantly learning new things.
So for the landowners that are out there that have an interest in plants, are there any tools that you recommend that they use, whether it's, apps or books, or, is there something that to help them identify, the different types of plants that are out there?
Oh yeah. Over the past several years, there's a lot of new resources that are really cool. Something that we've been using a lot at nature preserves, and also with Kentucky Native Plant Society, which is another organization that I work with a lot. We use iNaturalist all the time, and that's a really great resource to reach out to private landowners, any citizen scientist that's interested in plants or animals. But this past year, we organized the first Kentucky Botanist Big Year, 2019, and so we just want to get more people out there looking at plants, identifying plants, just noticing. We call it like spreading the plant love. Like the folks out there, I think we had over 100 people join in on that project. And then several other people that didn't actually join the project still were contributing to plant observations throughout Kentucky. But there was several landowners. Actually, this is a really cool tie back to the question you asked earlier. There was a landowner in the bluegrass that was trying to identify a lot of the plants that occurred on his creek. And he found a rare plant called the water stitchwort. It's a state threatened plant, so we had only known of about a dozen occurrences. That's what we call populations, occurrences, so I don't want to confuse people, but I always go back and forth to those different words. But he found this really rare plant. The plant, the water stitchwort, is limestone seeps. And so he had several of those limestone seeps along his creek. And so from him posting that on iNaturalist, then I saw it and we made that connection, and that information then feeds into our database, so then we can adjust or evaluate its conservation status within the state. He's interested in it just to figure out what's on my property, and he's also interested in conservation as well. So that's kind of like an interesting way how a lot of these types of projects can play out that are really exciting.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So we've been talking a lot about rare plants. Can you say why they're so important, and why it's so important to identify them, protect them, and understand them?
Yeah, that's a good question. At nature preserves, we look at all rare species. Insects is a big one. We have entomologists that focus on rare insects. Pollination is a big issue. And so I guess everyone always hears that term, the web of life, and how everything is interconnected. So if we bring that back to plants form the natural communities or the landscape upon which other animals, insects, mammals live. So plants form the homes of all the animals in the landscape. Mm-hmm. And so tying that back to, why does it matter within this natural community, like this particular forest, if several or a few of the particular plants that form that natural community, if they disappear. Mm. And so it always ties back to that web of life and how everything is connected. Mm-hmm. That particular rare plant might have a relationship with a pollinator that is specific to just that plant. So if that particular plant disappears, there's other species that are dependent on it that could also disappear. So that's one reason that I always go back to. We want to make sure that all species are protected because it's all connected in the end, whether or not we fully understand how it's connected or not. There's all kinds of interesting things that go on underground as well, and like relationships between mycorrhizal fungi and tree roots and different plants within that natural community. So there's a lot we don't know about how everything is all connected as well. So we like to say that plants are the foundation of life, and we think it's really important to protect all of them for that reason, to protect that web of life and all that interconnectedness.
What do you define as a plant? You've mentioned flowers and clover, yep. But are you talking trees? And I mean, all of that is I guess a loose plant term?
Yeah. So that's a great question.
Or anything with a root? I mean, how does
Yeah. So we look at many different types of plants. Of course, a way to categorize them would be in 3 different ways. We look at the vascular plants, the non-vascular plants, and then we also delve into the lichen world as well, which lichens are half mushroom, half algae. Algae are primitive plants. So we also do lichen conservation as well. But going back to the vascular and non-vascular, vascular plants are any plant with a vascular system. So that runs the gamut of trees, shrubs, herbaceous layer, all the different vascular plants. So anything that when someone thinks of a plant, you traditionally think of. And, everyone always goes back to flowers. All vascular plants have flowers. Some are more showy than others. Even grasses have flowers, which are actually really beautiful, but not many people think about a grass flower when they're thinking of a flower. Vascular plants, and then going back to non-vascular plants, that goes into the mosses and the liverworts and the hornworts. That's what we call non-vascular plants. So they don't have a vascular system. They're still green. They still photosynthesize. And their reproductive strategies are completely different. They have spores instead of seeds. And that's the same with ferns and fern allies as well. But anything from a tree that forms kind of the main structure of a natural community, or grasses and herbaceous layer if you're in a grassland system, all the way down to the little green stuff that kind of looks like algae but is technically it's a non-vascular plant. So okay. I don't know if that answers.
No, it does. It's a long, wide variety of what you would call plants, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In my thinking, I don't really think of trees as a plant. Mm-hmm. I don't know why, but I mean, it never even really dawned on me that you would consider a tree as a plant. Mm-hmm.
And there's rare trees in the state.
What are some examples of those?
This is a small tree, but the red buckeye, Aesculus pavia, that is in the horticultural industry. So sometimes you'll see that in arboretums and stuff. Its natural range is more of a southeastern species, and so we're on the edge of its range, and it occurs. We have just a few records within the state that occur naturally in natural areas, far western Kentucky and southern Kentucky. So that's an example. Of course, I mean, everybody's kind of heard of the decline of the American chestnut.
I was going to ask you about that one.
Yeah.
We actually did a show on one of the American
and the
chestnut.
butternut. Those are great examples of like a globally common plant tree because of diseases have become endangered. And so even though sprouts are really common still in certain areas of Kentucky, like the tree root sprouts of American chestnut, reproductive trees are endangered. And so those are actually on our state list. And the butternuts are too. And we track where the last, resistant reproductive specimens are of those two trees.
Anything that would make a plant become endangered. I mean, I don't know if elms would get to that point, but if it were the insect being what had killed them, that would automatically put those on your list if it turns out that there's very few left.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what has caused the issue.
It doesn't matter what has caused the issue. If with EAB, we're
Can you say what that is, just for those that may not know the term? Sorry.
So that's the emerald ash borer,
Okay.
which is an invasive pest, is slowly moving its way throughout the range of a lot of different species of ash trees. And so it's really hitting hard in Kentucky right now. Yeah, we're looking at that. There's a few resistant trees. We're working on evaluating the effects of that in forests with our forest biodiversity assessment program. We haven't thought about adding ash trees to the list yet. That we're still a long ways from that. They're still really common, and we don't know exactly how it's all going to play out. They're definitely declining, and the age structure is completely, changing from mature ashes to now everything's in the seedling and sapling stages. So that is a mechanism to where a common plant can become rare. Something else with ash that we're now, doing a lot of assessments is we have a forest biodiversity assessment program where we do a lot of we work in probably half the time forested systems and half the time in grassland systems. So we're in a lot of different natural communities, and then there's wetlands weaved all within those two different kind of overarching communities. Tying that back to the ash decline with the emerald ash borer, we're going to a lot of forests that had ash trees as a dominant or co-dominant part of that particular forest. And as those trees kind of fall, you're creating a lot of disturbance in the woods. A lot of tree fall, and then that changes the light regimes in the forest, and those types of disturbances. A lot of invasive species then colonize those canopy gaps that are caused from the ash decline. And so what we're seeing is those types of disturbances then increase invasive species that then affect the surrounding vegetation and decrease the diversity. So that's a whole new thing that we're seeing. If the ash decline happened 40 years ago, we might not have seen as much invasive species colonization in that route, just because invasive species like bush honeysuckle, winter creeper, Japanese stiltgrass, those types of things, they weren't as common 20, 30, 40 years ago.
It'd be nice if we could find a bug that would actually like bush honeysuckle and just take out bush honeysuckle.
That would be amazing. That's a whole different topic.
Right.
But yeah, there's I think a lot about that with a lot of the really bad players of invasive plants like that.
So do you work with other organizations that need this information that you might find some resistant tree?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're in state government. We work with a lot of agencies within state government, and we work with a lot of nonprofits across the state, other organizations. We have projects going on with so many different folks, but to tie it back to specifically what you were asking, when we work in forested systems, we, over the past several years, we're starting to have a lot more collaboration and communication with the Division of Forestry. So when that type of situation comes into play. Forest pests, and also with UK Forestry and Extension. We network a lot with Division of Forestry, with County Extension, which then feeds into UK's Extension. So because we're out a half a dozen botanists running around is a lot of boots on the ground.
Right.
It's a lot more than it has been in a long time. Our focus and our expertise, it always comes back to conservation, evaluating rarity, coming up with conservation strategies to prevent things from becoming extinct or, rare. The best way to do that is to have as many partners as you can. You can't effectively conserve Kentucky's natural heritage just with one organization with 30 staff. You have to build your conservation network all over the state. We've focused a lot on the past several years and why we've been able to grow our plant conservation section. We work a lot with different federal partners, state partners, Forest Service. We're doing a lot of surveys, monitoring management for rare plants for the Forest Service now. So we're a part of the Plant Conservation Alliance Network, which is a group of agencies, organizations, state, federal, nonprofits. That's a national group that just focuses on plant conservation issues and innovative ways to network and leverage existing projects. Through that larger national network, we've actually created the Kentucky Plant Conservation Alliance. And right now, Nature Preserves is kind of coordinating that. But that kind of alliance kind of formalizes some of these partnerships. Like, there's a lot of overlap with just natural areas management. There's a lot of natural areas managers throughout the state. They don't know that they're botanists yet, but they are.
Can you talk about some of the research that you have been doing?
For over a decade, we've been working with Dr. Barton on these really rare habitats in the southern Cumberland Plateau. So this is McCreary, Pulaski, Laurel, Whitley counties. So that's kind of this Daniel Boone National Forest area in the southern part. And in that particular area, there's these kind of really interesting and very rare headwater seeps that have really rare plants in them. And these headwater seeps have federally listed orchids in them, and it's all tied to the hydrology of these systems. And so when we first found this really large population of this orchid in this seep in the late 90s, we were able to purchase this property and turn it into a state nature preserve. But the habitat degraded and we were losing the orchids there. And it was all tied back to the hydrology of that particular system. And so brainstorming, how do we fix this problem? We need a hydrologist. We need somebody in here that can help us more effectively evaluate this natural community so that we can recover this federally endangered orchid. And so we partnered with Dr. Barton, and that's a really good success story. Networking with him and actually the Department of Forestry, the Forestry Club helped us several times, going out and helping us remove woody trees that have encroached into these wetland communities that were sucking all the water out of it. So partnering with Forestry and Dr. Barton helped us restore these really awesome wetland systems, and our orchids, the white fringes orchids, have just increased dramatically. So networking with universities and different folks to help us manage and study these resources is what really gets true recovery to happen. And then we can take that model that we used and then network with all of our partners in the Southeast to then say, well, we've restored this wetland, and here's our methods, our results, and you can use this model now to restore the wetlands in Tennessee and in Georgia. So
you had mentioned earlier about the different levels of plants and how they're globally or just Kentucky. So can it go the other way? For instance, like we have an abundance of them in Kentucky, but globally they're endangered.
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering that. It just from what you were just saying, it made me wonder if it could just be Kentucky and that's it.
Yeah. So there's endemic plants like the Kentucky glade cress that's only grows in the Dolomite glades around the Louisville area. We have over 100 populations of that in those 2 counties, but it doesn't occur anywhere else in the world. Here's another one. The Solidago rupestris, the river scour goldenrod, that is not on our list. That is, I think it's an S4. So it's not of conservation concern. This particular goldenrod occurs on kind of limestone scour zones in the Licking River and the Kentucky River and the Green River and several of our river systems in Kentucky. But globally, every other state where it occurs, it's actually on their rare plant list. So we call that, whenever that happens and our particular state has a lot more of it and it's not rare, and it's rare everywhere else, that means that we're kind of key for the conservation of that plant. So even though it's not on our state list, we still look at that as an important thing to protect and think about, because if all of a sudden that population's disappeared, then it would become globally rare because it's almost gone in every other state.
Right. You've presented us with a lot of great information, and we appreciate that. What would be a couple of items that you would want our listeners to get from this interview?
I think the main kind of takeaway would be plants are important. There are a lot of different types of plants out there in the landscape. So many different species, so lots of diversity. I think just like educating everyone about the incredible diversity of all the different plants and how they may be connected to particular pollinators or to particular mushroom or fungus. So that's one, but also, taking that knowledge and applying it to conservation. How can I make sure that this particular interesting plant that you've discovered, whether it be like a cool spring wildflower, whether it's rare or not, we just want to get the message out that our native plants and diversity is important, and we all can play a role in conserving all of these different plants out there. And so if you're out in a natural area and you want to learn more about how to identify plants, iNaturalist, use that resource. There's through Native Plant Society and also Kentucky Nature Preserves. Check the websites. There's a lot of different events going on all throughout the year, different hikes, different workshops that you can come and learn about how to identify all the different plants that we have in Kentucky, or learn about how you can restore. It's not just about education, it's about action too. How can you bring back these particular interesting plants that have disappeared on your property? It's all important. So
Thank you, Tara, for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.